My daughter told me she had a new best friend. For 3 weeks I had no idea that friend was a real person. It started the way most things with 9-year-olds start, casually, almost accidentally, slipped into conversation between dinner and homework. Emma came home one Tuesday and said she had met someone new and that this someone was, in her words, the most interesting person she had ever talked to. I smiled and asked the usual questions: what's her name, where does she go to school, does she live nearby? And Emma answered all of them with the kind of excited detail that kids use when something genuinely lights them up. Her name was Rose. She was very old but very funny. She had a garden with tomatoes. And she knew the best stories Emma had ever heard. I assumed it was a classmate. Maybe a new girl who had just joined her school, the kind of quiet, interesting kid who attaches quickly to one person and becomes their whole world for a season. I didn't think much of it. Emma had always had a vivid imagination and an easy way with people, so a new friend felt completely normal. But then a week passed and I hadn't seen anyone. No child at our door, no playdate requests, no name mentioned by any other parent at school pickup. I asked Emma's teacher during a routine conversation at the end of the week, just casually, whether there were any new students in the class. She said no, nobody knew since the beginning of the semester. I nodded and told myself I was overthinking it. Kids talk about friends in waves, intensely for a while, and then the name disappears and a new one takes its place. Except Rose didn't disappear. Rose came up every single day. Rose said this. Rose told me that. Rose has a recipe for something. Rose remembers when things were different in this neighborhood. That last one stopped me for just a second because it was a strange thing for a 9-year-old's friend to say, but I let it go. I was busy, the week was full, and Emma seemed genuinely happy in a way that felt healthy and warm, not worrying. By the 3rd week I started paying closer attention. I asked Emma directly, where does Rose live, when do you see her, why haven't I met her yet? Emma got a little evasive in the way kids do when they sense that an adult is about to complicate something simple. She said Rose lived nearby. She said they talked after school sometimes. She said I would like her if I met her. I asked her teacher again, this time more specifically. No new children. No Rose in any of the neighboring classes either. I asked a couple of other mothers at pickup whether anyone new had moved into the street with a daughter Emma's age. Nobody had, they said. The only person who had moved in recently was an older woman, maybe 60 or 65, who had taken the house directly across from ours about 4 months ago. Quiet, kept to herself, nobody really knew her yet. I mentioned all of this to my husband Daniel that evening after Emma had gone to bed. I told him I was starting to wonder whether Rose was imaginary, not in a worrying clinical way, I said, but in that gentle creative way that some kids hold on to longer than others. Daniel listened and said Emma was probably just being private about a real friendship and that I was reading too much into it. He was probably right, I thought. I decided to give it a few more days before I said anything directly to Emma. And then 3 days later, just after noon on a Wednesday, I looked out the kitchen window and saw my daughter walking out of the front door of the house directly across the street. I stood at that window for a moment and watched her skip back across the road and come through our gate like it was the most normal thing in the world. I met her at the door. I kept my voice very calm. I asked her where she had been. She looked up at me with those completely unbothered 9-year-old eyes and said, "At Rose's house, Mom. I told you she lives nearby." I sat Emma down at the kitchen table right then and there and I told her that I needed her to tell me everything about Rose. Not the highlights, not the fun parts, everything. Who she was, how they had met, how long this had been going on, and why Emma had never once mentioned that her new best friend was an adult woman who lived alone across the street. Emma didn't seem to understand why I was concerned. To her, the whole thing was completely simple and completely wonderful. She had met Rose about 5 weeks earlier, she said, when a ball had rolled into the garden across the street and Emma had gone to get it. Rose had been outside watering her tomatoes and they had started talking and Emma had just never stopped going back. She said Rose made her tea with honey and told her stories and let her help in the garden, and that it never felt strange because Rose didn't treat her like a little kid. She treated her like a person. I listened to all of this and I felt two things at the same time, a kind of relief that there was a real explanation, and a very real concern about my 9-year-old spending time alone in a stranger's house without telling me. I told Emma clearly that she was not in trouble, but that this was not something she could continue doing without me knowing, and that I needed to meet Rose before anything else happened. Emma nodded. And then she said something that stopped me completely. She said, "Mom, she's not just a neighbor." She told me who she is. She's Dad's mom. His real one. I looked at my daughter and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Daniel was adopted. He had known that his whole life and had always been at peace with it, or at least that was what he said. He had never searched for his biological parents, never expressed any urgency about it, always said that the parents who raised him were his parents and that was enough for him. It was something I respected about him and had never pushed. And now my 9-year-old was sitting at our kitchen table telling me that his biological mother had moved in directly across our street 4 months ago. I asked Emma to tell me exactly what Rose had said. And Emma, with the straightforward honesty that children have when they don't yet understand the full weight of what they're carrying, told me everything. Rose had come from another country many years ago without papers, without legal status, without any safety net at all. She had become pregnant and had made the hardest decision of her life. She gave her baby boy to a family who could give him what she couldn't. A stable home, a future, a life without the fear that she lived with every single day. After that she had spent years working, learning the language, studying, doing everything she needed to do to build a legal life in this country. It had taken a long time. And once she had her citizenship, once she had something solid under her feet, she had started looking for her son. She had found him. She had found us. And she had moved across the street and she had been trying to find the courage to knock on our door for 4 months. Instead, a 9-year-old with a ball had knocked on hers. I called Daniel at work and asked him to come home early. I didn't tell him why on the phone because I didn't know how to say it in a sentence. When he came through the door I sat him down and I told him everything Emma had told me, slowly and carefully, watching his face the whole time. He went very still. Not angry at first, just still, the way people go when something is too large to react to immediately. And then the stillness shifted into something harder and he said he didn't want Emma going back there, and that this woman had no right to come into our lives through our daughter, and that he needed time to think. I gave him that time. I didn't push. I told Emma that for now she needed to stay home after school and I held her while she cried a little because she missed Rose and didn't understand why something that felt so good to her was suddenly so complicated for everyone else. 3 weeks passed. They were hard weeks. Emma was quieter than I had ever seen her, moving through the house carefully like she was trying not to take up too much space. She wasn't her usual self and she didn't pretend to be. And Daniel was struggling in his own way. I could see it in the way he sat at the window sometimes in the evening, looking at nothing in particular, somewhere else entirely in his head. One afternoon while Emma was at school and Daniel was at work I put on my coat and I walked across the street and I knocked on Rose's door. She opened it and she looked at me and her eyes filled immediately, not with drama, just with the quiet overwhelm of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time. I told her I wasn't there to make any decisions. I told her I just needed to hear her story from her directly. She nodded and stepped back and let me in. We sat in her kitchen for 2 hours. She told me everything, the fear of those early years, the pregnancy, the impossibly painful decision to give her son away, the decades of working toward a life that was legally hers. She told me what it felt like to finally find him, to see photographs of him online, to discover he had a wife and a daughter and a life that looked warm and full and good. She said she had cried for 3 days when she found him, not from sadness but from relief. She said moving across the street had felt like the only way she could be close without forcing herself into something he hadn't chosen. And she said that when Emma had walked into her garden that afternoon 5 weeks ago, she hadn't planned any of it. She had just been a lonely woman talking to a child who wanted to talk back, and it had taken her 2 full weeks before she told Emma who she was because she hadn't known what else to do. I went home and I sat with everything she had told me, and that evening, after dinner, I told Daniel I needed him to really hear me. I told him what Rose had said, not as an argument, just as a story, her story, the way she had told it to me. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. And then Emma, who had been in the hallway the whole time in her socks on the wooden floor, came into the room and walked straight to Daniel and put her arms around him and said, "I love you, Dad. And I think it's kind of amazing that you have 2 moms. That means I have 3 grandmas." Daniel looked at our daughter for a moment. And then something in his face changed, slowly, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. The next morning, all 3 of us walked across the street together. Daniel knocked on the door. Rose opened it and looked at him and didn't say anything at all. He said, "I think we should get to know each other properly." She stepped back and let us in, and we sat in her garden and drank tea and talked for the rest of the morning. That was a year ago now. Rose is part of our life in the quiet, steady way that the best people become part of your life, not loudly, not all at once, but gradually and surely until you can't quite remember what the shape of things looked like before them. Emma goes to her garden every week. They still drink tea with honey. And the imaginary friend who started all of this became the most real person in our story.